What's up YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. Lately in Southern California, the weather has been warming back up, and you know what that means. That's right, camping season is among us. Before I get back out there, however, I wanted to take care of some maintenance issues and also some upgrades on the Land Cruiser. So for the next few weeks, I'm going to be focused on refreshing the entire front suspension on the Land Cruiser. I'm going to be swapping out brand new CV axles, dropping the front differential, and changing the diff bushings at the same time. I'm also going to be reinforcing the front lower control arms, as well as reclocking the torsion bars, just to make sure the ride height is still where I want it to be. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any of those videos. But for today's video, I'm going to jump in headfirst and change something that is pretty difficult to do, but everybody should do it, and that is the steering rack bushings on the 100 series Land Cruiser. My steering rack is actually still in okay condition. It's not blown, it's not leaking any fluid. However, the bushings themselves, I think, have already given out because the steering rack moves a whole lot when you turn the wheel left to right. And there's some sort of vagueness in the steering wheel where there is I would say a delay when you turn the wheel and you get a response from the vehicle. So when I was doing research for this job, there are a few people on Mud that said they were able to switch out the bushings without removing the steering rack. I looked on YouTube and there was basically no videos on this job being done. So I figure it's probably my turn to give it a shot. Make sure you watch the entire video, guys. At the end of the video, I'm going to be giving you my opinions on the new polyurethane bushings, as well as some tips that might help you with the install. Let's take a look at the bushing kit that I got for the 100. Now, this kit is for my 99. There is some discrepancy between the 2003s and later. This is supposedly for the earlier model, but they also advertise it to fit 98 to 2007, so you have to be careful. What it comes with is you've got these metal collars, 2 of them for the driver's side mounts, and then you've got these hats. So how these work is one goes on top, one goes on bottom, like this, and then the sleeve goes through the middle to hold the bolt in. And then on the passenger side, we have this guy, which is the bigger bushing. This one should be relatively easy to get on. It's split right here, so you can get it over the steering rack and slide it in pretty easily. We've also got some bushing lubricant. So this is to lube up the insides right here. You can see they have like little grooves in there to keep the grease in. That way the this sleeve will slide in a little bit easier and it won't squeak and all that good stuff. The kit I got from Amazon, it was relatively inexpensive. I think it was like right under 30 bucks. You can go with different kits like White Line and all these other things. But in general, they're pretty much the same thing. So I'll leave a link in the description down below so you guys can check that out. But now let's take a look at the car. So let's take a look underneath the Land Cruiser. As you can see, the factory skid plate was already removed, and I tried to pressure wash as much of the dirt and mud off before working on this because I don't know about you, but I don't really like the taste of dirt and mud too much. Now if we look down here, this is the passenger side. You'll see this is where the bigger bushing goes, and then towards the driver's side here is the smaller bushing. You've got one on the front and one in the back. So these 2 bolts are the ones that hold in your bushings. So these guys are long bolts, and then there's a nut on top. What you have to do is hold the nut up there and then loosen these guys. I don't think these have ever been loose before, so we will try and see if we can get them loose. They look like they're pretty stuck on there. Let's take a look at the one in the back. And this is the one in the back. You can see it's pressed into the steering rack still. It's really close to the oil pan, so hopefully I'll be able to get that out, but we shall see. Now while you're down here, it might be a good chance to kind of just glance over everything underneath the car. This guy is the front diff bushing. I still haven't changed mine out yet. I'm probably gonna do that pretty soon. This part also, you can see the bushing itself is leaning towards the up position, so I think the plastic's going bad. The steering rack, I don't think it's leaking yet. There's a little bit of, no, maybe from the oil filter, I'm not sure. This side, the driver's side, looks okay. If we look at the passenger side is pretty dry, so I'm not too worried about the steering rack yet. Hopefully it's got another couple years of use. Then we're gonna look at the tie rods, and the outer tie rods look like they're in good shape. I don't see any issues with the tie rods. They're not loose or anything. I used a pry bar earlier to see. As far as the CVs go, notice I do not have the diff drop yet, so the angle of the CV is pretty extreme right now with it jacked up on jack stands. But I think the CV is okay. Ooh, is that it? This might be an issue right here. It looks like a little tear on this CV boot, so I might have to address that. Over here, actually, over here, the CV, the outer CV boot is completely ripped. This one I didn't even notice until now. This one will probably have to get swapped out ASAP. I might invest in the diff drop kit too while I'm doing that, so that way it won't happen again. But as far as the outer tie rods go, they look like they're in good shape. The ball joints at the bottom of the knuckles or the control arms look like they're in good shape. Passenger one still looks okay as well. There's no leaks or breaking or anything like that. I changed these guys out not too long ago. Maybe it's been like a year or so. They've been hanging in there pretty good. No issues, so that's always good. If you're interested in swapping the lower ball joints out yourself, I will leave a link to my video that I did a while ago in the description, so make sure you go ahead and check that out. Anyhow, I am going to try to get these bushings out now without removing the rack from the car. Wish me luck. So for the passenger side, it's a little bit difficult to get to, but this is how I have it set up. You can see I have a swivel 3/8 with a 19 6-point socket at the end, and then this is where the handle comes up to. I can put the end of the jack handle on here, give it a little bit more leverage, and see if we can break this guy open. So I don't know if you can see that, but you can get to the back bolt for the passenger side from the front. So I don't know if this is the easiest way, but this is the way that I found, because in the back side you've got the diff to worry about, so that kind of gets in the way. But the handle goes all the way to the front right here, and it's just enough to give it a good turn. So I was able to break it loose. I couldn't do it on camera because you know, only have two hands. Now that all the bolts are out, let's see how much room we have to work with. It's not much, but I think it might work. So that's the passenger side bracket. Passenger side bushing is out. That was relatively easy. Now for the fun side. So this is the front bushing on the driver's side, and I have it propped up right now with these pry bars, and unfortunately for me, this looks like it's still in decent shape and it didn't fall out by itself. So what I'm planning to do is to push it out from underneath. Now how I'm going to do that is by using this extension, going through that hole and pressing up against that metal collar on the inside, and in theory it should have enough space to let it pop out up top. Let me give that a shot and see if that works. Ta-da! Got the front one out. That wasn't as bad as I expected, but I'm sure the rear one will be worse. Finally, I was able to remove the steering rack bushings out of the Land Cruiser without removing the steering rack. So the steering rack is still inside the car. Now let's take a look at these old bushings. This one is the passenger side one. It is the bigger one. This one was relatively easy to get out compared to the other two. Again, these guys are rubber, so it's a little softer, a little bit more give compared to what we're replacing it with, which is the polyurethane one. These guys are a little bit stiffer, so hopefully they don't move around as much. Now, as for the bushings go, we've got these two guys, one for the front, one for the rear. And if you look at these, they're not too bad of a shape. Like, they all came out in one piece, both of them did, and it was in better shape than I expected. However, you're starting to see some cracks on the plastic itself, right around the metal collar. You can see it right here in the front one, and the rear is a little bit on the rear, not too bad. One thing that I did notice with the factory bushings is, if you look at the side of it, you can see there are two rubber like pieces stuck onto the edges. Now I guess that makes sense because there are arrows on this, and they want you to put this this bushing in with the rubber bits on the side, so I guess it stops it moving from left to right, but you'll still have that vagueness because you've still got this cavity of space between the bushing itself and the steering rack. So even though you don't technically move the steering rack up and down because you're only steering left to right, it's still gonna let the bushing move around in the steering rack itself. Now luckily on the polyurethane ones there is no such thing. It is the same diameter all the way around, so there will be no room for the steering rack to go anywhere, left or right, up or down, or whatever. So it should be a lot firmer of a steering feel. The only downside to these polyurethane ones is because they're such a tight fit, it's gonna be pretty difficult to put them into the rack. Oh, almost forgot, I was going to show you guys the tool that I'm planning to use. Now this is just a threaded rod that I got from Home Depot, and a nut, and then we have a small washer. This rod, I think it's a 3/8 in diameter, so I'll list the part later. But what I'm planning to do with this guy is, because the bushing is not able to push in by hand, obviously because it's super stiff, I'm gonna put it kind of on top of the steering rack and then pull it in with this thread, with a rod.
So what I'm gonna do is put it in like this, have a nut and washer at the top, and when I tighten this bottom nut, hopefully it'll pull the bushing into the steering rack, and that's, you know, me being very, very hopeful. Usually they're a little bit annoying to get in because they're so tight, and also the reason why I got such a small rod instead of a slightly bigger one is because the nut on this rod was slightly thinner, like not as tall, I guess, as the rod that would have fit the sleeve. So even though it doesn't fit perfectly, obviously it's still small for the sleeve itself. It's a lot of room. The nut is not as tall, so, and if you remember, the oil pan is right there on that rear bolt. So hopefully by using this smaller rod and nut, everything will fit. Anyways, let's get to it. Okay, so I have this guy all set up with my threaded rod. Okay, the washer's the wrong way, but that's okay. So the top is the nut. We've also got a big washer underneath the nut. Then we have the bushing sitting on top of the steering rack. Now I actually was able to get the metal sleeve in there too. So the metal sleeve I put in there first, and then push the bushing kind of like gently on the metal sleeve, because if you have the metal sleeve already in the bushing, there's not enough room to get both of these guys in there at the same time. So hopefully this will work. Now what I gotta do is unthread this guy and put the washer in the right spot. So now before I start pulling the bushing into the steering rack, I want to spray it with a little bit of silicone spray that'll help it go in. You're not supposed to use that grease where the bushing meets the steering rack. The grease is actually only for the metal sleeve inside the bushing. So let's try to get a little bit in there. And I already greased the sleeve inside, so we should be okay. That should be plenty. And then we can start tightening it down. Ta-da! We got the top side in, and that was difficult at first. I had to modify the bushing slightly to get it in, and once I did, it went in pretty easy. Now it's pretty tight. So I've got the bushing in there as well as the metal sleeve. Now I gotta do the same for the front, and also after that we're gonna have to push in the bottom bushings too, which are under the steering rack. So actually, let me show you what I did with the bushing. So this one is a stock bushing, and if you guys can see this specific brand of bushing, it has a very, very straight cut at the end where it's supposed to go into the steering rack. So what happened with mine is it wouldn't self-center, and then when I tried to get it to center as much as I could, it would tweak a little bit or not sit properly. Now what I did with this guy to get it in to sit immediately was, I don't know if you guys can see that, I ground down the edges ever so slightly with the Dremel. So what that does is I ground it all the way around. So what that does is when I have it sitting on the steering rack, it kind of just wiggles around and centers itself. When you apply pressure with the threaded rod, it's already centered, and the only way it can go is down. So that worked really, really well. I do suggest you just grind down the corner, the little corner of the bushings slightly with the Dremel, or if you have a file or something, you got to do it all the way around, and then it goes in relatively easy. So I'm going to do the grinding on the rest of these bushings and then push them all in. So I've got the front top bushing set up. I'm going to try to see if I can get it to seat, and just going to tighten this guy down Looks like it's going, but we shall see. So I finally was able to get the upper bushing in. What I had to do was hold it exactly flat with one hand and then tighten the bolt underneath with the other. That's why when I was holding the camera, I couldn't get it to sit completely flush. But now both of the top hats are already in there. I just need to get the bottom ones in. So let's figure that out. So wanted to show you guys before I tighten everything back up. I lifted the steering rack a little bit to get the bushing in right here. It's not technically in, it's just kind of sitting on there right now. So what I'm going to have to do now is get the threaded rod back in through the top and then tighten it down. It should be a little bit easier now because it's pressing up against the flat spot on the subframe. So as long as the steering rack is relatively straight, I mean flat, parallel to the subframe, it should go in easy, but we'll see. Like I suspected, the bottom one went in really easy because it was butt up against the subframe, and the subframe was technically pushing it in, and that was perfectly flat. So unfortunately I didn't get any footage of that, but I'll try to get some when I do the front bottom bushing, which I was gonna do right now. So this is the front driver's side lower bushing, and I'm prying the steering rack up with the pry bar right now, and you can see the top bushing and the metal collar is already in there. So now I'm gonna insert the lower bushing and try to push that in as well. So usually if the bushing didn't seat properly when you loosen the nut, it'll just pop right back out. But seeing that it did go in correctly with the rod completely out, the bushing is in the steering rack. Yay! For the passenger side bushing, which is this guy, should be relatively easy. We just have to open it, put it onto the steering rack, and then put this bracket on top like so, and then have the bolts bolt back in. So should be easy. Let's find out. You can see from the mark, this is where the old bushing was. What I'm gonna do is put it back in kind of the same area. So there we go. We got the bushing in, and make sure the flat side is facing the subframe, obviously. Get all the dirt and stuff off. Now we're gonna put the bracket on top and then bolt it down. Now just push the bracket down all the way into the bushing. You don't have to push it all the way down if it doesn't want to go. You just want to do it as much as possible, because what will happen is once you line up the bolts will pull it down. So I was able to line up the bolts with the threaded holes in the subframe. Now it was a little bit tricky. I would like to point out sometimes the steering rack, because you're moving it around so much, it might have shifted left or right like mine did. So when I had it shifted to the right side, there was no bolt holes in there, and it took a little time to figure out, but once you get the rack where it's supposed to be, then the bolts should just thread in really easy. So you definitely don't want to strip these guys. Take your time with it, and it should thread in just fine. Now all I gotta do is these bolts right here on the driver's side, front and back, and we should be all good. And there we have it, guys. We have the driver's side bushings in, as well as the big bushing on the passenger side. And man, was that not fun.
So that is it, guys. The new bushings are installed in the Land Cruiser. It took me roughly about 4.5 hours to complete. There wasn't a lot to do, but the stuff that you had to do was definitely very time consuming because of the restrictions on space. I did get a chance to give it a quick test drive, and oh my gosh, the steering feels a lot better. Well, obviously, the steering rack is no longer moving left to right, up and down like it did before. It is very, very stable against the subframe now, and you can actually feel the difference in the steering wheel. There is no longer that lag or delay when you turn in or when you hit a bump or anything like that. I wouldn't say the steering feel is harsh compared to before, like there's a lot of vibration or anything, but you can definitely feel more of the road in the steering wheel, so you get a better connection between the wheel and your front tires. Now, as far as tips and tricks to make your life just a little bit easier, tip number one, make sure you get that threaded rod. It is $1.28 at Home Depot or something like that. It is totally worth it. You could use a bolt, but I wouldn't know, like you'd have to get exact measurements on how long the bolt would have to be and all that stuff. Just get the threaded rod, because tightening the lower nut is a lot easier than figuring out how long of a bolt you'll need and if you need spacers and all that stuff. So get the threaded rod, 2 nuts, and 2 spacers. Tip number 2, if the edges on your bushings didn't already come slightly tapered like mine did, make sure you use a file or a Dremel to taper them slightly, so that way they will self-center themselves onto the steering rack, and when you pull, they'll go in very, very easily. So that's it for this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Like I said earlier, I have a ton of good repair and maintenance stuff coming up for the front suspension of 100 series Land Cruisers. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.